Okay, this is going to be Industrial Labor Part 3, the third of the national scale labor organizations that were established in the 1880s, and one which still exists today. In 1885, the American Federation of Labor was set up. The organizer was an immigrant. He'd come when he was about 14. His name was Samuel Gompers, and he was a cigar maker. And earlier in his life, he had been involved in more radical labor movements, such as the communists are already out there making a little bit of headway. He rejected that to go for just regular, um, ordinary workaday concerns. Now, the American Federation of Labor is not and has never been a union. It is a federation of unions. Unions may affiliate with the American Federation of Labor. They could coordinate efforts, that sort of thing. So the American Federation of Labor, until not that long ago, was actually a fairly conservative organization in the grand scheme of things. The American Federation of Labor had a big growth spurt around the turn of the 20th century as businesses were combining into huge monopolies. The American Federation of Labor um, also grew at a rapid rate. Just to bring it on down to the present day, the 1920s were a tough time for organized labor because the economy, for one thing, was seemed to be doing extremely well during that decade. Real wages rose by an amazing percentages. Management had softened toward labor and decided that, or realized that the best way to maybe discourage organized labor was not to fight against it, but to answer some of its grievances. So pension plans get set up, wages go up, that sort of thing. There was even a company somewhere that would buy gasoline at very cheap bulk rates and allow their employees to buy it at less than retail. Stuff, things like that. It's called welfare capitalism. Anyway, even as that was going on, there was a kind of a movement within the American Federation of Labor of unions and leaders who wanted to organize unskilled workers. Now, typically, unions affiliated with the American Federation of Labor were skilled workers who looked far down their noses at unskilled workers. So this caused some tension. There was actually a new type of union that came along that did not just organize workers with certain skills, it organized everybody in a whole industry. There are two main examples that are still around: the United Auto Workers and the United Mine Workers Union. The United Auto Workers, or the UAW, doesn't just organize people who work in automobile assembly plants who do certain things. It's everybody who works there, for, I would assume, wages instead of salaries, all the way down to people just, sweep the floor, that kind of thing. So you have the United Auto Workers, you have the United Mine Workers at the same time, and others like them. And by the early 1930s, they had formed a kind of club within the club called the Committee for Industrial Organization. And anyway, that's by around 1932. In 1935, I'm way ahead of the time frame for Unit 1. I'm just telling you kind of how we got to the present day. There's a messy divorce, and the industrial unions are the kind I'm talking about that will organize or admit to membership both skilled and unskilled workers. They seceded from the American Federation of Labor and renamed themselves the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO. So for 20 years, you had rival national organizations, the AFL and the CIO. In 1955, under the leadership of United Mine Workers head Walter Reuther, I think it was Jim Mine Workers, he might have been UAW, I don't even know, we'll fix it. Um, they reunited again under the name AFL-CIO. And organized labor is not doing particularly well right now. Um, they tend to get greedy. They tend to negotiate contracts with high wages and maximum benefits, and without fully realizing they're competing in a global labor market. And employers will pay them those wages because they have to keep going in the short run, but those jobs are going overseas because there are people in parts of the world that can do the same jobs and would be happy to do them for a fifth as much money or less. So that's reversed in very recent times, but um, it's labor tends to see management as the enemy. That would be like the players seeing the coaches as the enemy. That in order to survive, they've all got to be on the same team. Anyway, that's more update than you really needed, but we'll call it off for industrial labor part 3. We're going to move on to urban growth and immigration. But before we move on to urban growth and immigration, I thought I'm leaving something out. And then okay, here's what we're going to do. There was a component of the labor movement which was extremely radical. All right, the American Federation of Labor um, did not challenge capitalism. Lots of others did. Arguably, the most seriously exploited workers were miners, particularly coal miners, places like West Virginia and Pennsylvania, where the conditions were dangerous. You'd start working there as early as like age 6 because your little body would fit into tighter places. You spend your short life breathing coal dust. You live in a company town and housing provided by the company because coal mines aren't usually located next to real towns. But the thing is, your rent for your company house is checked off from your pay at rates of 2 to 4 times what similar housing would cost in a real town. Plus, you don't get paid in United States currency. You get paid in funny money called scrip, no T on the end, SCRIP, scrip, and you can only spend it at the company store. So you're limited to shopping there, and again, the prices are marked up 3 or 4 times as high as they would be outside. So that'll make you radical pretty quickly. So in the eastern part of the country, the coal miners, there was an extremely radical sort of terrorist organization calling itself the Molly Maguires. And out west in the gold and silver mines, you have the, I believe, Western Federation of Miners, and some historians refer to the word war, and they use it without irony, the war between the Western Federation of Miners and the Colorado State Militia in those days. There could still be violent strikes. There was an economic depression that began in the United States in 1893, lasted about 5 years, and at one of Carnegie's steel mills. There were violent incidents where the company had hired um, Pinkerton detectives. Okay, a man named Pinkerton had been involved in security during the Civil War, and he later established a detective agency, and they'd do pretty much what you wanted them to do. So Pinkerton men, they're called. They fired on striking miners, not miners, but steel workers at one of Carnegie's factories. So violence was threatening. Also, around the turn of the century, somebody set up something called the Industrial Workers of the World. The acronym was IWW. Their idea was one big union, and they would leave like stickers all over the place. One big union that could bring capitalism to its knees. They weren't really thinking about higher wages and shorter hours. They were thinking about destroying capitalism and bringing in a kind of workers' paradise. And so you have these people all involved in it, or of course socialists who were very, very sincere in those days, and some communists. Um, the United States in the first decade of the 20th century had 2 different communist parties. Neither one of them had membership beyond the 4 figures, but the difference was in one of them, some of the leaders could speak English. In the other one, None of them could. They were all immigrants who had brought really radical ideas with them from back home. So it wasn't just an idle warning that such things were going on. So that's another component of industrial labor in those days, and it seems like they're always with us. Now we can move on to urban growth and immigration.